Lillian Coppell, and I am the Executive Director and one of the co-founders, along with Dan Lifton and Marsha Cross, of HPV Cancers Alliance. We are a nonprofit organization, and I'm thrilled to welcome all of you to our Emerging Science webinar series. So thank you for being here. I want to thank the panel in advance, and I also want to thank Dan, and I want to thank Ella. Special thank you to Ella for putting this all together. So for those of you who are not familiar with HPV Cancers Alliance, we are a nonprofit organization, and our mission is to empower individuals and with knowledge about the health and lifestyle impact of HPV infection and embolden them to take action to prevent and treat the HPV virus and eliminate its consequences. On to the next slide. So here we have our vision: eliminate, as I said before, eliminate HPV attributable cancer deaths through prevention, early detection, and effective pharmaceutical, surgical, and integrative adjuvant treatments. Oh, here. Sorry. Okay, we have a program with mission partners. We have over 40 mission partners. Together, we work together to amplify the message, and the message is, at the end of the day, nobody should die from HPV. So together, along with our mission partners, as you see some of them, St. Jude, Farrah Fawcett Foundation, we share messaging, and we cross-promote each other's information. So today, the Emerging Science webinar series was created to highlight the groundbreaking research, innovative therapies, and critical conversations happening in the field today. It's a platform for thought leaders to accelerate progress in HPV-related health. Tonight's focus is on emerging immunotherapies and clinical trials for HPV cancers. And we're honored to feature an incredible panel of experts who will guide us through this transformative topic. This is our first webinar, but the next few webinars in the coming year are going to focus on prevention, access and outreach, infection and early cancer detection, and survivorship support. Dan, take it over to you.
Hi, I'm Dan Lifton, and since I'm verbose, I was asked to just thank a few of the folks who have been supporting our organization over the last several years, including many of the panelists today. We have an amazing medical advisory board who are all incredibly busy people, and in spite of that, they donate a lot of their time to help our organization. So we will be introducing Paul Ramasur at MSK, who was, in addition to having the very important job of taking care of Lillian when she was his patient, has been an incredible resource for us, and he will be moderating today's event. We also have Karen Goodman and Judith Smith, who are in the panel today, who've been with us from the beginning. And then some of the folks are not here, but Stephanie Blank, Aaron Katz, Carl McDougall. I want to call them out specifically for all of the volunteer work that they've done for our organization. I also want to thank our partners and our sponsors. We receive unrestricted grants from a number of organizations. One of them actually is my company, but we have a lot of amazing pharmaceutical companies. There are some nonprofits who say, oh, well, we don't take money from Big Pharma, but our view is, our mission is spread knowledge, save lives. And there are many organizations, individuals that are involved in that movement, and we want to partner with all of them. And the incredible amount of progress that's been made, both through physicians and surgeons, as well through some pharmaceutical companies, investors, and everybody in the ecosystem has really been incredible. I was listening recently to the fact that Jimmy Carter recently turned 100 after being diagnosed with metastatic cancer of the brain and the liver, and the fact that 10 years later he can still survive through chemotherapy, Keytruda, and some of the other therapies is really miraculous. So we're very honored and appreciative of all of our sponsors, particularly those who sponsor our scientific events like this one, and they're the ones that are asterisks here. So again, thank you so much to all the individuals and people behind it. And now let me turn it back over to Lillian to introduce, again, the series and our moderator. So Lillian, back over to you.
Okay, so as I said before, but I didn't have the slide up because I don't know what I'm doing with these arrows. Some things never change. Prevention, access, and outreach, infection and early cancer detection, and survivorship support are going to be our topics for the future, for this coming year. So I want to introduce Dr. Romaser. He is the Director of Colorectal and Anal Cancer Radiation Oncology at MSK, Memorial Sloan Kettering Cancer Center, and a physician scientist with an interest in developing novel radiation sensitizers for gastrointestinal tumors. In addition to his clinical practice, he is actively involved in groundbreaking research and clinical trials in cancer care. He's committed to advancing the field of radiation oncology through the development of personalized strategies, and is focused on the importance of prioritizing organ preservation while ensuring capability. And if that was not enough, he volunteers on our board and the Anal Cancer Foundation. Dr. Romaser's experience, leadership, compassion, and humility have made him a trusted authority in the treatment of these cancers, with the patient being his top priority. I know because I was his patient 7 years ago, and so was Steve Post, right there on the end, who was also his patient about 4 years ago, right? 4 years ago. I felt safe and reassured by his personalized care, empathy, and unwavering support. And I wish that there were more doctors like him out there. It would be a better world. Dr. Romaser.
Thank you very much for that kind introduction, and welcome everyone to this wonderful evening that we have on this session on HPV-related cancers and emerging immunotherapies. It's a field where innovation really meets hope, and collaboration will drive our progress. We're really privileged for our extraordinary panel that we have with us of experts who are really at the forefront of the research and clinical aspects of bringing emerging immunotherapies into the clinic for patients with HPV-related cancers. So I just want to start off a little bit to just set the stage, just from an educational perspective. We're here because human papillomavirus affects everyone, men, women, any gender you have, any way you identify, any color of skin, all walks of earth. It can cause oral pharynx and anal cancer in men and women, cervical and vaginal and vulvar cancers in women, and penile cancers in men. So we know that the virus is actually associated with the cancer, and that the virus can actually lead to the cancer. The human papillomavirus can hijack the cell's own machinery to express what we call oncoproteins. These are proteins that are directly made by the virus and can actually cause or lead to oncogenesis, or the formation of cancer. One of the proteins that I want to highlight, or two of them I should say, are the E6 and E7 oncoproteins, which inhibit the P53 tumor suppressor and the RB tumor suppressor respectively. And I highlight them because you're going to hear later about a novel vaccine, cancer vaccine, that's targeting these oncoproteins as its antigens. So we're here because of immunotherapy. What is immunotherapy? Well, immunotherapy really uses our own body's immune system to fight cancer. Just like we fight bacteria and viruses when we get colds and sick, now we want to leverage that against cancer in our body. We work by helping the immune system recognize and attack cancer cells. We want them to be seen as foreign and have that taken back. There's many different types of immunotherapy classes, even many more beyond than what's on the slide, but today we're going to focus really on two for the subset of this seminar. One is the checkpoint inhibitors, which are really essentially, most cells and immune cells have gas pedals and brakes, and we can essentially leverage those so that we can accelerate or activate the immune system to target the cancer cells. The cancer cells sometimes can express proteins that can turn off the tumor cell so they can activate the brake on the immune cell. And so we can essentially target those with antibodies that bind these proteins to now turn the T cells back on. So instead of having the brake applied, you can take your foot off the brake, and that'll help the car go forward. So this can allow the T cells to expand and attack the cancers. And there's many different types of checkpoint inhibitors, CTLA-4 inhibitors, PD-1, PD-L1, LAG-3, but most of what we'll talk about today will be PD-1 inhibitors, but we'll hear about a whole broad spectrum of these from our esteemed panelists. So just to show it to you, this is a T cell in blue on the left and a tumor cell in red on the right, and you can see that the T cell is expressing a protein called PD-1, and the tumor cell has the PD-L1 receptor. What you can see is that when those two come together, it's like a brake being pushed on the immune cell. It's saying, don't activate, don't attack, calm down, I'm okay. But when you now take an antibody that blocks PD-L1, you can now remove that brake. By removing that brake, you can activate the immune system to go in and target the tumor cell and actually kill it. And that's what these drugs are trying to do in principle. In addition, we're going to hear about some novel cancer vaccines. Vaccines help our immune system recognize and attack cancer cells. This works just like vaccines that protect us from flu or pneumonia, or those that protect us from the HPV virus itself that we encourage vaccination in young adults and young children. But here the cancer vaccines are designed really to mimic cancer-specific proteins or antigens. And we already alluded to a vaccine that we're going to hear about from our panelists that targets the E6 and E7 oncoproteins. This is the BNT113. So that's enough from me, and hopefully I gave you a little bit of a primer for what we're going to hear about. But more importantly, I want to hear from our extraordinary panel of experts who, again, are really at the forefront of research and care in this area. So first, I'd like to introduce Dr. Karen Goodman. She's a professor and vice chair of research in radiation oncology at Mount Sinai and is a globally recognized expert in gastrointestinal diseases. As chair of the National Cancer Institute's Gastrointestinal Steering Committee, Dr. Goodman plays a pivotal role in shaping the national clinical trial portfolio for gastrointestinal cancers. Her research focuses on integrating radiation, chemotherapy, and immunotherapies to improve outcomes while minimizing treatment toxicity. Thank you for being with us, Dr. Goodman. Next, Dr. Manish Shah is a renowned leader in gastrointestinal oncology and serves as director of the GI Oncology Program and the Gastrointestinal Oncology Research Laboratory at Weill Cornell School of Medicine. He's a distinguished peer-reviewed investigator and has led numerous phase 1, 2, and 3 clinical trials for advanced GI cancers. His groundbreaking research explores genetic and environmental factors underlying cancer development and treatment, with a focus on upper GI malignancies and developing novel therapeutic strategies. Thank you for joining us. Dr. Roisin O'Carroll is a medical oncologist at Memorial Sloan Kettering Cancer Center, specializing in gynecological cancers. She serves as the clinical director of the Solid Tumor Cell Therapy Service, the research director of the Gynecological Medical Oncology Service, and the director of Patient and Family-Centered Care Grant Initiative. Dr. O'Carroll's research focuses on advancing therapies for gynecological cancers, and she leads multiple innovative early-stage clinical trials incorporating really novel immunotherapy strategies, and we're looking forward to hearing some of those today, so thanks for joining us. Dr. Alan Ho is chief of the Head and Neck Oncology Service in the Department of Medicine at Memorial Sloan Kettering, where he specializes in head and neck cancers. He's a distinguished peer review researcher holding multiple R01s from the National Cancer Institute, and he's led numerous practice-changing trials. He's deeply committed to understanding cancer biology at the molecular level, and he focuses on developing cutting-edge treatments that can enhance patient outcomes. Thanks for joining us. And last but not least is Dr. Judith Smith. She's a professor in the Department of Obstetrics, Gynecology, and Reproductive Sciences at the University of Texas Health McGovern Medical School and a clinical pharmacy specialist. She is a trailblazer in researching the safe integration of nutritional and herbal supplements with conventional cancer therapies with a particular focus on women's health. In fact, she ran one of the only randomized clinical trials looking at novel herbal supplements to combat and eradicate HPV, chronic HPV infection in young women. And she did not only ran the trial, but she also did very informative and groundbreaking basic clinical translational research on that population. So thank you for joining us. So if we could welcome our panel, please. So Dr. Ho, I'd like to start with you. What are some of the foundational pillars in treating HPV-related cancers?
Well, thank you so much for having me. Really happy to be here with all of you. Well, I think to break it down in basic terms, when we think about the disease, we have to separate it into different stages. And so for us in head and neck cancers, for locally advanced tumors, we're treating with what we call curative intent. So we're using multiple modalities of treatment, whether it's radiation and chemotherapy and or surgery, to achieve a curative outcome for patients. In that setting, one of the key questions that we're facing is, in fact, the really good prognosis that HPV-positive head and neck cancer patients have. So early stage HPV-positive head and neck cancer patients have a really good prognosis, and we often worry that maybe we're over-treating them. So there are these opportunities to what we call de-escalate treatment. So can we select those good prognosis patients to give them less radiation, give them less chemo, so that they can be cured of their cancer and be free of the toxicities of some of the treatments that we give. And then the second stage is when the disease spreads to distant places. And in those situations, we're really thinking primarily about systemic treatments or drug therapies. And how can we use, including immunotherapies, to control or shrink those tumors. And I think across all the different HPV-related cancers, we have different uses of immunotherapy, which I'm sure we'll get into.
Great, that's a good start off. And Dr. Shah, why does incorporating immunotherapy in the treatment of HPV-related cancers make sense?
Yeah, so that's great. And also, I'd like to thank everyone for inviting me. It's really great to be here. HPV cancers, it's really interesting. It does actually involve a gamut of diseases, head and neck, anal and cervical. It's interesting. So in head and neck cancer, HPV is, it actually helps you maybe tailor your treatment a little bit. In anal cancer, although the majority of anal cancers are HPV related, the treatment is relatively uniform. Whether you're HPV positive or negative, you're getting a similar treatment. With regard to immunotherapy, head and neck cancer and anal cancer, really, they're at least head and neck cancer, squamous cell cancers, they're really, the immunotherapy works really much better. In anal cancer, there is modest benefit of immunotherapy. They are approved, but we think more of local direct therapies, cytotoxic therapies and radiation therapy. HPV itself, when it incorporates into the DNA, it can activate some of the signaling that immunotherapies are effective on. So it activates, overexpresses PD-L1 in the tumors, for example, and that's the target for some of the immunotherapies. But in anal cancer, the benefit of immunotherapy is, I would say modest, 10 to 15% or so when used by itself. And I think there are strategies to improve that with combination treatments with radiation or with other chemotherapy. Those studies are ongoing.
So Dr. Goodman, Dr. Shah just mentioned the combination of radiation to help facilitate or activate a response to immunotherapy. So in your opinion, how does immunotherapy improve the benefits of radiation and vice versa, and why does it make sense to combine them together?
Thank you. No, I also want to thank Lillian for the invitation to be here and to be part of this organization. It's been, I think, really important to get the word out and and educate the community. So, I think, well, first I just want to comment on how anal cancer in about, it's HPV positive disease or related to HPV in about over 90% of cases, which is very different from, say, head and neck cancer, which is rising in incidence in terms of the HPV-related cancers. And I think it even was sort of a model for the ability to de-escalate. So we've always treated with radiation doses that are much lower for anal cancer than we did for head and neck cancers. And that wasn't always clear as to why we were getting better results with a lower dose of radiation in anal cancer. And I think that really speaks to the fact that we were treating an HPV positive tumor and didn't know it for many years. And it wasn't even until maybe about 15, 20 years ago that it was clear that what percentage of patients had HPV positive disease with anal cancer. So now we're moving into this era of adding immunotherapy, and I think there is a lot of rationale for adding or combining radiation and immunotherapy for several reasons. Number one, with the use of radiation, we have the ability to break down the tumor and do something where we actually, it's called antigen presentation, meaning that it breaks down the tumor and kind of presents the tumor cell proteins to the immune system. And so that can help for the immune system to recognize these cells or these proteins as being foreign to the body, and then hopefully with the combination of stopping having the brakes on the immune system, we can actually upregulate the immune system really focused on that tumor. So I think there's a lot of rationale. We're seeing it in other types of cancers, but we're hopeful that there's actually a study that's looking at the addition of immunotherapy after standard chemoradiation for patients that have more advanced anal cancer. The study hasn't, it's been completed, but we don't have the results yet, but we're hopeful that this will show that using radiation after the chemoradiation, using the immunotherapy afterwards will enhance the effects of the radiation.
So that's wonderful. So Dr. O'Carroll, we're talking about immunotherapy to enhance our ability of our body to fight the cancer, but what about side effects? Do we ever turn the immunotherapy on too much and it starts to attack our own body?
Yes, we do, but thankfully I think we've got really good at managing the side effects, and also I think education is key, especially for our patients, that they know to report the weird and wonderful. So they're not feeling so good, they're feeling fatigued. Sometimes that can be a sign that perhaps their thyroid isn't functioning well. We know now to check very carefully for that as well. So we've routinely checked that, but we can have stories where a patient is suddenly becoming a lot more thirsty or something like that, and that might be a sign that, or they're maybe asking us for some additional IV hydration. That could be a sign that maybe their cortisol has been affected as well. Or in fact, very rarely we can see cases of diabetes. So we have a very good understanding now. The most common side effects that we see are fatigue and rash. They tend to be early, and we kind of also have a good idea of when the various side effects occur and what the time frame we expect to see them. So I think the big difference in why it's not so scary to give immunotherapy anymore is the fact that our clinicians are very educated, our patients are very educated, and when they call us, we also
No, it's not our mics. Something else.
Okay. When they call the office, that we're very attuned to what may appear subtle symptoms, but may in fact be harboring a significant toxicity. And so early intervention is key, and often we're able, through early mitigation, often we would give a course of perhaps steroids, and we're able to avoid significant toxicity. But I don't think that's possible without everybody being so aware of, to report increased loose stool, like that might actually be harboring, that the patient could develop colitis. But if we intervene really early on, then we can avoid that completely.
So it's almost like the patient and doctor working together to really
Yeah, and all the
early
support
intervention
staff, not
education.
just the doctors, but all the allied, great support staff that we have. We've been down to the secretaries that triage a lot of these calls. They're so attuned and know when to escalate things quickly.
Yeah, that's wonderful. That's wonderful. Yeah, please, Dr. Shah, please.
So that's exactly right. And I think, from my standpoint, a patient may begin to get symptoms like on a Thursday and then say, I'll take some Imodium, and then if they don't call on Friday, then they let the weekend go by because they don't want to bother somebody. Just bother us. We really just need to, jump on any of these side effects right away, because so the side effects really occur, as Roshan said, because you're activating the immune system against the cancer, but sometimes the immune system gets activated against your own body. And so then you can develop colitis, which is inflammation of the colon, and you get diarrhea, bloody diarrhea cramps. You get pneumonitis, shortness of breath. The earlier you act on it, that means that your immune system hasn't acted enough, and then you can turn it off quick. If you wait too late, then there's more that needs to be done to turn it off, and that may then lead to admission and much higher doses of steroids and much more prolonged course, and that can affect how well the immune system is in terms of fighting the cancer. So I just wanted to reinforce what exactly she said, that the earlier we can identify these symptoms and the earlier we can act, the better it is for the patient, and that's really what we're trying to achieve.
Yeah, that's a great point, because I think a lot of patients wait to call until things might be a little bit too far along. And so it's good to hear from multiple of you that early notification to your doctor is really what they're looking for and what they want on your end. So I think that's a great point. So Dr. Smith, we heard about the different responses to immunotherapy in head and neck versus anal, and we know that cervical and other of these HPV are somewhat different. So what makes a cancer that's HPV related in the head and neck respond differently than one in the anus or the cervix? And how can we get around that?
To the immunotherapy?
Yeah.
Well, it's probably has a lot to do with the ability of the immune system to identify those locations and have drug distribution that way. These were often given in combination with chemotherapy to enhance the effects of the chemotherapy. So it has a lot to do with the body's ability to reach those locations, and the more less circulation to that area, the more difficult it will be to get an immune response.
Great, thank you so much. So I want to get in a little bit more into some of these combinations that you guys have alluded to. So I think one of the ones that we want to highlight or discuss would be the addition of lenvatinib and pembrolizumab. So I'm going to start with you, Dr. Ho, and then I'm going to come to you, Dr. O'Carroll. So Dr. Ho, how does lenvatinib help improve, or does it improve, the efficacy of pembrolizumab? And help us kind of walk through that and how you think about it.
Yeah, I mean, I think first it needs to be said that these immunotherapies are quite effective, but what we learned in head and neck, and I think is the case for all the diseases that we treat, is the impact or the efficacy of these approaches are just not enough. So if you really look at the data in head and neck, just with these anti-PD-1 approaches, only about 1/5 of patients actually benefit. So that means 4/5 are really not getting the major responses we need. This is what's really the incentive to really think about what can we use in combination to augment the immunotherapy effects that we're seeing with those drugs. Lenvatinib has been one of these strategies that have been tried on a variety of different cancers. And I have to say that the other theme here is, the immunogenic profile of tumors, the biology of tumors are all very distinct. So you can't assume if a combination works in one area, it's going to work in another. It requires testing in all these different areas, even if they're all HPV related. So lenvatinib is an oral drug that you take. It's FDA approved in a variety of different cancers. It targets a variety of different proteins, but most prominently a protein called VEGF, which we feel that is what we call immunorepressive. So the tumors create a lot of this VEGF to create blood vessel invasion, but also it brings in a lot of different cells that kind of combat the immunostimulatory effects of these drugs. And so the idea is if you combine this with an immunotherapy, you can enhance immunotherapy responses and maybe get that 1/5 of patients up to a higher percentage of patients that get response. So I'll just say that in head and neck cancers, this has been evaluated with varying success. The early phase data looked very good, where the overall response rates were indeed enhanced, but we unfortunately got disappointing news earlier this year in the randomized phase 3 trial where they compare the combination to pembrolizumab alone, which is the anti-PD-1. And unfortunately, even though they improved the response rates, they improved the time that patients had their disease controlled, the overall survival of the patients was the same in both arms. And so we're really trying to tease that apart right now, and I think one of the things that comes out of this is not only the efficacy part of this, but what we were just discussing, the importance of managing toxicity and being able to maintain patients on these treatments, ensure that if they fail those treatments, they're still in shape for subsequent treatments. And so we don't have all the answers, but at least in head and neck cancers, we haven't been able to see that good signal in the randomized trials. It is FDA approved in a variety of other malignancies like endometrial and kidney cancer, So, but that's really the point, is that you really need to look at and evaluate these combinations in the different diseases that we treat.
Do you think the combination's dead in head and neck, or you think we just need to figure out who will respond better to this combination versus?
I think the concept is alive. I think the issue is how can we overcome the shortcomings of the trials that have been done. And so that's where, so the data was presented earlier this year. We're going to see more of the data and get a deeper analysis about where we could have improved it. And like I said, very impressive improvements in response rates and what we call progression-free survival. We have to tease apart why the survival is not happening. There are other drugs out there that claim to have better toxicity profiles that are now being evaluated in this space with a very similar kind of rationale. So I think that idea and the concept is still alive. But to really know and to rationally design better approaches, we really need to dig deep into that data.
Great, thank you so much. Dr. Carroll, follow up on that. So does the combination of lenvatinib and pembrolizumab have any similarities to regimens that you're using in gynecological cancers, and how do you see it fitting in your space?
Yeah, I mean, for the treatment of recurrent endometrial cancer, having the option of pembrolizumab and lenvatinib has been an absolute game changer. Patients where I had very limited treatment options, now we have patients do exceptionally well. And our biggest concern is how long should we go? Patients are doing so well. We're at 3 years. Should we continue 2 years, 1 year? That's an amazing place to be, where previously the survival outcomes were very, very poor. So we now have new antibody drug conjugates as well. So it's a really exciting space to be in, loads of really great treatment options. In terms of cervical cancer, to Dr. Ho's point, just because it works in one disease setting, and endometrial cancer and cervical cancer, I mean, the two areas are right beside each other, but actually they're treated quite differently. And we have to be quite aware that patients frequently have received a lot of radiation. And we always worry about the risk of fistula. And so just because it worked in one organ doesn't mean that automatically we could perhaps see a different side effect profile. So one thing I think especially that I would be thinking about is if a patient had prior radiation, I might be a little bit more concerned regarding the risk of subsequent fistulas. And the good news is that we're able to move immunotherapy a lot earlier in the disease course. So a lot of these patients may actually, in fact, have received some kind of immunotherapy with their chemoradiation. And definitely in somebody who's presenting with metastatic disease, we're offering these patients immunotherapy in combination with other similar targeted agents, bevacizumab. So I think, and then we have the antibody drug conjugates as well. So trying to sequence these and figure out who would derive the best benefit probably will be the big challenge. I know we're not talking about prevention, but I cannot overemphasize how important the vaccination is. And like cervical cancer is a very, very avoidable disease. And that's the key message that I would really like, is that we have all these great treatments, but prevention is so much better than cure, and can't overemphasize how important the vaccine is, the HPV vaccines, both for girls and boys. So I obviously would vaccinate my own kids. It's just so important to try and avoid a lot of these.
No, I love that plug, so thank you so much. I mean, my favorite stat on the HPV vaccine is if it was applied universally across the world and it had full efficacy, it would eliminate 5% of cancers worldwide. That's stunning. There's very few single interventions that can do such a dramatic difference. And again, for a country like the United States, to continue to see cervical cancer when it's preventable, at least HPV related, it's something that hopefully the vaccination rates will pick up. So Dr. Shaw, can you imagine in the future that some of these immunotherapy and cancer vaccines are going to replace cytotoxic agents in HPV-related cancers, or is it a one-size-fits-all, or as we're hearing, is it really going to come down to what plays out for each individual HPV cancer subtype?
I need to phone a friend. No. So that's a great question, and I will actually call on the panel to help. But let me first start by saying that the disease context does matter, but what we're learning with immunotherapy is that the earlier you use it, the more effective it is. So just at our national meeting a few months ago at ASCO, in melanoma, It's not an HPV disease, but we can learn a lot about it. If you give immunotherapy before surgery for melanoma, you could actually avoid any more treatment afterwards. So it was a randomized study, and patients got 2 months of immunotherapy, and then they had surgery. And it was compared to people who got surgery first and 6 months of treatment. And the people who got 2 months and then surgery did much better. So I think that the same paradigm will apply to other cancers as well. If we are able to apply immunotherapy before the cancer becomes very advanced, we will be able to be transformative. So in colon cancer, for example, immunotherapy really only works for a subset of cancers where they have a lot of mutations. But before the cancer spreads to another organ, even colon cancers that don't have mutations have responses to immunotherapy where they don't in the advanced setting. So I think the same can be applied to HPV cancers. If you apply them early, you might be able to avoid protracted treatments afterwards. So I think that's one part of the question that you're asking. In my joke, I forgot the rest of the part.
I think that was a good cover. You did well. You did well. So let's talk for a minute, I guess, about the BNT113 vaccine. So we know this is an HPV-specific vaccine. So Dr. Goodman, what's the rationale? Why not just give the vaccine? Why are we looking at combinations with immunotherapy? Does it make sense to consider other combinations? What are your thoughts so far on it and the emerging data on it?
Well, again, this is not my expertise, although I think the area of vaccination as a sort of an adjunctive treatment to standard of care makes a lot of sense because, I think the ability for the body to completely eradicate a very large tumor just by, the vaccination and immune system in a sort of standard tumor, not like the high mutational rate of the colorectal cancers is pretty rare. So I think that there's a lot of interest in looking at the E7, E8 targets, which we were talking about earlier. But I know at our institution we're also looking at some other targets as well. So there's some other proteins that we're looking at that may be more what we call immunogenic, that may be able to make the immune system even, further, have more activity. So some of the things that we've been talking about is there's something called E2. There's, that may have a more immunogenic approach. But so I think it makes a lot of sense if you do, sort of the standard of care chemoradiation, and then you use your vaccine as an adjunct or what we call or a post standard of care treatment. And I think then we also have to learn how to use it in the metastatic setting, which is sort of not in my wheelhouse, but I think it makes a lot of sense also where you have low volume disease that's more spread out throughout the body to use the immune system in that situation. So I was going to say I'd call a friend too because that's out of my wheelhouse.
Yeah, you want to go? Yeah.
No, I think I'm just going to echo in, just like step it back a little bit. When we're talking about vaccines and the preventative versus the therapeutic, we have part A and part B of our immune system. So when you think about prevention, we're activating B cells. And so that is a different type of our immune response, and those are creating antibodies. Versus when we're using our therapeutic vaccines, like the BNT113, those are activating the T cell or part B of our immune system. And the E6 and E7 proteins that we saw on the diagram before, those proteins get brought to the surface by, we call them antigen presenting cells, whatever. So that is basically sensitizing those cancer cells to be seen by the T cells. And the immunotherapy is coming in because we're putting the brakes on, and so that way the T cells can be more active. So the vaccine and immunotherapy are kind of like a 1-2 punch against the cancer cells, and that's where it really makes sense to use them together.
Wonderful, thank you. Dr. O'Carroll, you are leading multiple early stage clinical trials looking at novel immunotherapies. what right now are really exciting to you, and what should people be watching out for? What's on the horizon? What's coming?
I mean, a lot of this, we talked about the category of immunotherapy, but anything that really eradicates cancer often could be considered some kind of immunotherapy, because usually we need the immune system to eradicate the cancer. And there are a lot of exciting bispecifics. There's HPV targeting ones. We have a lot of new antibody drug conjugates that can be used in combination with immunotherapy. I think there's a lot of excitement with those. And then one area that I'm particularly interested is in cell therapy. And so there's been really exciting data, regarding tumor infiltrating lymphocytes, or TILs, so a type of cell therapy similar to what has shown great efficacy in melanoma. So there are a lot of different avenues that we're exploring. I think it's not going to be a one-size-fits-all. It'll be really trying to figure out which patient's tumor would respond to a particular strategy. And even the sequencing, we talked a little bit about, we can paradoxically sometimes make the response worse by giving immunotherapy at the wrong time. So really trying to tease out what the optimal sequencing is, especially if we involve radiation. There's a lot of discussion about that. And in cervical cancer, we've seen that patients perhaps maybe who have more nodal involvement, that they might actually benefit more than patients who have very minimal disease when we're giving the checkpoint blockade. Similarly with the vaccines, it's like Judith mentioned, I think trying to figure out exactly what you're triggering or what you're planning to. Sometimes we're trying to target multiple proteins, like Dr. Goodman mentioned there, and maybe not just the traditional E6, E7, but there's a lot of other, or altering the tumor microenvironment. The best analogy that I heard was, it's like the cancer is like Harry Potter's invisibility cloak. So you're figuring out a way to remove that invisibility cloak so the immune system can see the cancer and then attack it. And there's no one answer to that. And that's why we have so many different approaches. And I think that will be the key, is working on all these different ways to figure out for each individual how we can eradicate the cancer.
So the cell therapy is really interesting. We haven't actually talked about that much or defined it for our so do you just want to mention quickly the premise of what cell therapy is?
So the idea is to almost administer like a living treatment, so that you're administering, often it's called adoptive cell therapy. So usually it's involving T cells. There's lots of different ways that you can make those T cells. You can, in the TILs, the idea is that you took a component of the patient's cancer, their own infiltrating lymphocytes, and then you remove them, and then in the laboratory you try and expand the ones that you think are going to help attack the cancer, and then you infuse them back. That's kind of the analogy for that one. In CAR T cells, you genetically modify them. That maybe isn't the ideal approach for HPV-associated cancer. The other one that we look at is the TCR, or T cell receptors. Often, though, that you need two things to match. You need your target, which there's HPV-16 targeted TCR, but then you also almost need a tissue typing, which is called a HLA. So that one is a little bit less scalable to everybody, and they are quite expensive and very timely. They take a lot of time to develop, to actually expand the cells. So something that we're working on, the ideal would be if you had a product that was that you could just, like an off-the-shelf, so we call that an allo product, that you could just, it's ready, and then you give it to the patient, and the hope is that it would work. You often, though, have to give quite high doses of chemotherapy so that we suppress their own immune system a little bit, so that when the cells are given, that they're able to do their job, find the cancer, and then hopefully elicit an immune response, and then actually expand and make the immune system be able to continue to fight the cancer. That's the ideal. And that is a very exciting area. It has a lot of side effects, so that is one that we're still a little bit scared about and still learning how to do that. Usually these treatments need to be given in the hospital, and often there are other medicines that we have to give, such as IL-2, to help make those treatments work better, help those cells that you give stay in the body so that they can actually act on the cancer.
That's great, and we know you're doing a lot of these cell therapy trials, so we're looking forward to seeing more and hearing what you learned about. Dr. Shah, I think you wanted to add something, please?
So I wanted to highlight just a little bit after Dr. Carroll was saying, the amount of technology that is applied to medicine now is so incredible compared to even 10 years ago. So if you think about it, radiation and chemotherapy have been around for a relatively long time, and they're kind of blunt instruments to try to attack the dividing cells, which are the cancer cells, to kill them. Dr. O'Carroll mentioned something called drug antibody conjugates. So these are antibodies that they were able to add a chemotherapy agent to the antibody. So the antibody is now delivered to the target, and then it gets internalized, and then the chemotherapy is released from the antibody and then directly delivered to the cancer, almost like a Trojan horse. The CAR T that she mentioned, so we figured out on the T cell how the T cell might recognize the cancer. So they're able to create a new antibody that goes onto the T cell, and then it's infused to the patient to treat the cancer. So like these are just 3 different things that have happened in the last 5 years that we're able to use in patients. So I think that one of the biggest challenges we have is with this technology, we have to now figure out how to best weaponize it to maximize the treatment for patients. It's not just chemotherapy and radiation, although that's kind of what we do, but it's like 1,000 other things that we need to figure out how to do better.
And for you and Dr. O, how do you guys pick, with all these options, all these opportunities, how do you pick which tool you're going to take out of your toolbox and bring out next for your patients if they're not responding to your current treatment?
Yeah, I mean, well, I think a good example in head and neck is, when patients present and they need systemic therapy, the FDA-approved guidelines now allow you to think about immunotherapy on its own or immunotherapy plus chemo, because both have been demonstrated to improve survival. And how do we make that choice? Of course, patient preference is number one. Of course, a lot of patients want to avoid chemotherapy, so hence this drive to really develop more chemo, regimens that lack chemotherapy in it. The issue, though, of course, is, as I mentioned before, is that only a fifth of patients benefit from immunotherapy alone. So if you've got a patient who's got small disease and doesn't have symptoms, that's an okay approach to go. You've got room to kind of decide. But if you have another patient where the tumor's growing really rapidly, it's in the neck, and you're really worried about vital structures and you really need a response, those patients need to get chemotherapy, immunotherapy. So it takes all of those things. You have to consider tumor location, aggressiveness, patient preference, safety, to make these decisions. And then, after that, clinical trials is always at the top of the list. Regardless of all the advances that we have now, there's no doubt much more needs to be learned. There's a finite number of treatments available for all the diseases that we treat. And the only way to move the ball forward to develop new standard therapies is through clinical trials. So all the trials that we run at all of our various institutions are so critical because they expand patients' treatment options beyond the finite. And so that's where pushing forward research, pushing forward innovation and development is really important.
And I know that all of you on the panel are esteemed clinical trialists and have led essentially practice-changing trials, not only HPV cancers, but head and neck, GI, pancreas. Dr. Goodman, in your position as the chair of the NCI Gastrointestinal Steering Committee, you steer the national decisions and influence the trials that come in nationally. Can you tell us a little bit about how you and the team collaboratively identify concepts that you want to bring forward and how you choose what's ready for phase 3 and a more advanced practice-changing trial versus what may not be?
So I think it's an iterative process. We really start at the level of our colleagues at places like Mount Sinai Memorial who are doing this kind of really early phase work, and as that comes out of the institutions, they can bring those ideas to groups that we call cooperative groups, where they can discuss what are the real priorities for focusing on, such as, do we need to find better treatments for patients that have failed a certain treatment for a certain type of cancer, and then, what are the new, the data that are coming out of these institutions. So it sort of percolates its way up to the setting of, there's information about safety, tolerability, and then some efficacy. And then when you really want to ask questions, and especially things like, where we may not have a drug company that wants to sponsor a trial. So that's where the National Clinical Trials Network, which is what I'm involved in, or what all of us are involved in really, is really important because, otherwise these studies may not be done by a drug company. So things like sequencing, when do we do the immunotherapy, the radiation, chemotherapy, those questions may not be answered by industry-sponsored trials. So that's where our teams are able to run these trials. And because anal cancer, for instance, or some head and neck cancers and cervical cancers are relatively rare compared to, say, breast or colorectal cancers, we often can't do them in just a small setting. We need to do them in a cooperative group setting where institutions across the country are entering patients onto trials. So, it really is, we're sort of looking at where things are coming from at the early phase, what sort of are the suggestions for questions that are important, and then as they move through, the sort of phase 1, phase 2 setting, that's when they head to the cooperative groups, and then we can make decisions about where we want to invest.
When a cooperative group trial wants open, just for the viewers, how many places is it normally open at around the country? And what is it, who participates? Are patients aware it's national?
Yeah, it's, most of the time we have hundreds of
Wow.
institutions opening the trials. And they're not just, the big hospitals, big academic hospitals. They're hospitals across the country that are, maybe small community hospitals that can participate in this. And I think this is really critical for us to be able to understand not only how do we do in a high volume institution in New York City, but how do we do with patients in a smaller hospital, in maybe a rural area. So and we try to have, I think another big part of what we're trying to focus on is making sure that we're representing the diversity of our patient population in the United States, and getting as many patients who have various backgrounds, history of various comorbidities too, because we understand that we can't just apply what we see in a certain subgroup of people to the majority of the population.
And Dr. Smith, you ran some clinical trials looking at
But before we get
Go
there, I
ahead.
just wanted to echo, like, NRG Oncology actually has branched out to be international. So a lot of those trials that we're looking at, we can go to places where cervical cancer is much more predominant in some of the other countries. And so we have a whole initiative with our cooperative group now to be international as well with our NRG Oncology studies. And it's really helped with enrollment and accrual to those studies quickly. In record time compared to historical cervical cancer trial could take 10 plus years to finish, and now we can finish it in less than 3 years. So it's really been a game changer for the cooperative group to branch out.
It's amazing to hear about, cancer diplomacy, right? It seems to break down barriers, and it's somewhat refreshing in this day and age. So Dr. Smith, you ran one of the few clinical trials that was truly randomized in looking at a nutritional supplement to help activate one's immune system to combat HPV. Can you tell us a little bit about that trial and about the need to do more trials in this space?
Yeah, so it's in more of the prevention step where we were looking at patients with high-risk HPV. We started our studies on the bench all the way through. I do a lot of drug development, so I took the same approach to give the validity to my medical colleagues as well that want to know the science. We're able to define the mechanisms, and then we were able to accrue that study fairly quickly, looking at high-risk HPV using a nutritional supplement called AHCC that was able to modulate the immune system, activates the T-cell mediated cytotoxic cells that eradicated the HPV. And it was really important to me to make sure it was placebo controlled and it was blinded. So like all the check boxes that we require for drug development, and to be able to see that through and see, it was close to a 60% response rate. And what we learned a lot in that study, because it was blinded and we had arbitrarily said, not arbitrarily, but from the base on the pilot studies, picked 6 months as our timetable, and we learned a lot about the immune system and said, well, actually, some patients need it longer because their immune system is not as strong, and so that's like we're progressing. And then we found some unique markers for monitoring for HPV itself, like interferon beta, is a true marker for HPV infections, and now we're going down that road to see like how could we use this maybe to help identify patients with high-risk HPV infections, and then monitor for response and clearance, especially in third world countries where they don't have the resources that we do here in the U.S.
That's awesome, and congratulations on the trial. I think that's really a big step, and certainly doing a placebo-controlled trial in that setting is definitely first class. So, Dr. Shah, we heard from Dr. Ho. He mentioned a trial that was negative in head and neck, looking at the combination of lenvatinib and pembrolizumab compared to pembrolizumab alone. Phase 3 study, hundreds of patients. And I asked him a couple questions about, well, can we salvage it? What does it mean? But so, when you think about national studies and think about what we can learn from a negative trial, can you just talk about how important negative trials are as well as positive trials, and what we learn from the community from everything that we do?
Yeah, thank you. So I wanted to, it actually dovetails nicely with what Dr. Goodman was saying. I think one of the most important things that Dr. Goodman's the GI steering committee does is it really carefully weighs what the impact of the trial would be if the hypothesis is true, but also what it would mean if the hypothesis is not true. And so you're learning something whether the trial is positive or negative, which is really, really important. So for example, new technology that is really exciting actually across all cancers is something called circulating tumor DNA. So that's you take a blood sample and you look for pieces of DNA that may be coming from the tumor, and you might be able to use that information to tailor therapy. So there are several trials that are ongoing now, and then also being developed to see if that can be true. So if that trial is positive, then we've learned that we can actually use this blood sample to help tailor therapy. And if it's not true, we still learn the impact of this DNA on predicting recurrence or on other things like that. So I think that one of the advantages of the cooperative group trials is that we actually really kind of milk it for all that we can get, like positive and negative. Oftentimes industry studies, they're really focused on the drug because that's how they make money. So if the drug trial is positive, then they're able to move forward. If it's negative, they may shelve the drug. But for NCI trials, I feel like it's actually more than that. It's the drug, but it's also the disease and the context and what else we can learn from it.
No, that's wonderful, and I think it's important to know that we learn as much from both ends of positive and negative. So we're getting near the end of our discussion tonight, but I want to ask each panelist 2 last questions. One, I want to know what's your big takeaway for our audience in terms of the discussion that we had tonight. What's the main message you want them to remember? And the second question is I want to know what excites you the most right now in the field of HPV-associated cancer treatment? And I'd like to start, why don't we start with you, Dr. Goodman, and we'll go down the line.
Yeah, thank you for that thought-provoking question. Let's say, I mean, I think from tonight's discussion, a couple of things. First of all, I completely agree that prevention is definitely the way to go. I mean, this is, I look at my patients and, I say, well, hopefully if you make sure your daughters or sons are vaccinated, I'll be out of a job and I can, relax and retire. But truly, I mean, to minimize the impact of these diseases on the, long-term quality of life. While fortunately, HPV-related cancers are very, very sensitive and responsive to treatment, we do have, significant impact on long-term quality of life with radiation and chemotherapy. I think the other thing that is exciting is just to hear about all of the new combinations of therapies that are out there that we're learning about. I think we have a long ways to go, but it is amazing. And I think, as Dr. Shah mentioned, how much has been done in just the last 10 years to bring so many new technologies into our armamentarium. And I guess the thing that I'm most excited about is, I think we are at a point now where we're really have like a critical mass of people that are interested in HPV. That it's not. Especially in the area that I treat, it was always something people don't want to talk about. Anal cancer, it's not a, something that people feel comfortable letting other people know they have the diagnosis. But there's now this sense that this is, falls into a family of cancers that has a really interesting, what we call etiology or reason for developing, and has potential to have a really, interesting way of treating it rather than just thinking about it as a typical cancer. It's based on the immune system. There's so much that we can develop to target this type of cancer. So with the vaccines and everything. So I'm really excited about the future. Hopefully I'll be retired with no patients with anal cancer anymore, and we'll have, if they do, they have great treatment. So.
Yeah. So I think it's hard to say exciting time, but there's a lot of optimism because we have much more opportunities for new treatments to fight cancer. I think just the explosion of our understanding of how HPV can actually transform the cancer and then lead to the proteins that we can target by a vaccine, for example, can be transformative because we then now can apply the vaccines in different ways to even further improve the chance that the cancer may not come back. As Dr. Ho said, in some contexts, because of the sensitivity of HPV associated head and neck cancers, you can actually tailor therapy to de-escalate. And I think that's actually part of the spectrum of what we're doing across cancers. Is trying to tailor therapy to maximize benefit and minimize toxicity. And so our ability to do that is actually only going to get better and exponentially better. So I think those are some of the things that I'm really, really excited about. And I think that I also share Karen's hope that we can retire early and off into the sunset. But I actually think that with the new technologies that we have, we'll actually have more work to do to figure out how best to tailor them in a way to maximize benefit and reduce toxicity. So I'm not so worried about retiring early.
Yeah, I mean, I think one key takeaway is immunotherapy is paradigm shifting, period. It has really changed the way that we treat cancers. It has remarkably changed the outcomes. We've had incremental successes, but immunotherapy is that big step. Despite that, not enough patients benefit. And so this is where the drive for more innovation, more research is needed. And in terms of HPV, I think the most exciting thing now is finally you're seeing science drive therapeutics. It's been 20 years since we knew HPV drove head and neck cancers, and yet we still don't treat them differently. So the emergence of these vaccine strategies, BioNTech is just one. There are several that have been presented. We presented data earlier this year. When you see efficacy across the board, you know that approach is a sound approach, right? So using the biology of how we know how the HPV virus works, how it drives cancers, and using that scientific insights into actually developing therapies, that's the most exciting thing for me.
All right, that is a lot of takeaways from tonight. I kind of have a flashback with immunotherapy. Has probably been one of our best kept secrets because when I still remember evaluating patients on TIL therapy when I was a resident in 1996 at the NCI. So it's so exciting to hear Dr. O'Carroll talking about it finally moving into the gynecologic oncology arena. So I think it's exploding now because we're now being willing to try innovative approaches of using immunotherapy in solid tumors, which is just super exciting. And particularly makes a lot of sense with HPV-related cancers because they are viral infected, at origin. So I think we're on the right track with incorporating immunotherapy in making advancement for these HPV-related cancers. I think still going back to prevention is going to be key, and that's where a lot of our research is working. Is so that if you do have the unfortunate experience of having that HPV-related cancer or infection, to begin with prevention and getting rid of that infection or preventing it altogether, So I think as we move ahead, that's really where our research will continue to focus in identifying those patients faster.
So that's wonderful. So we heard about vaccination as prevention. That's definitely a strong message from the HPV Cancers Alliance. We've heard about the immunotherapy as a paradigm shifter, the need to be optimistic with what's coming up, and that we're going to see innovative trials. And I want to thank my panelists for leading those trials, for being here tonight, for educating us, for educating you, the viewers. Thank you for joining us tonight, and everyone else. I'd like to hand you back to Dan Lifton, and thanks everyone for this wonderful evening.
So on behalf of the HPV Cancers Alliance, again, I want to thank our amazing panelists. I think the takeaways that we're going to be spreading knowledge of is prevention through vaccination, clearing the HPV before it turns into cancer using natural compounds like AHCC that Judith was doing study on, doing screening and diagnostics and catching the cancer as early as possible so that we can intervene with the immunotherapy early, because as you heard, the earlier you intervene, the better results you get. And then finally, for those out there who do get diagnosed, we encourage you to reach out to us so we can introduce you to these incredible doctors who spend decades studying and then practicing and then learning about the disease. So we do get outreach from a lot of patients in rural communities and otherwise who don't necessarily have access to these world-leading cancers, and we do provide them with that access. So again, enormous thank you to all of you. And just to wrap up, I'm going to go ahead and introduce our founder and executive director, Lillian.
Okay. I just want to thank all of you. I'm going to speak for Marcia as well. We're really very humbled to have you here because, you know, as Marcia says, she's a celebrity and fans are coming up to her, but she's so humbled by what all of you do and the fact that you're here and the breadth of wisdom that you bring here. I mean, I'm just a regular person. I can't operate my phone. I can't operate my arrows. And I never thought I would be, you know, amongst all of you. And I had a good story because of Dr. McDougall and Dr. Bronson, who both saved my life. But, you know, we talk to a lot of patients every day. You know, everything's about the patient these days, and they don't always have that good story. So I just feel so fortunate that you guys were here today and that we have your numbers now. I can call you. and also for Dan, who encouraged me to start the organization.